We are now changing gears slightly and looking at the sector from a sustainability lens. But before I begin, I'd love to just level some kind of understanding as to what we mean by sustainability. We're talking about the interconnectedness of these three pillars that you see on screen. The economic efficiency, there has to be growth, there has to be prosperity or productivity to exist so that we can have a point of departure. Then we move on to the social equity aspects, and these are really looking at some of the more complex topics within our economy, really dealing with issues of poverty, transformation, succession, health and wellness, human rights aspects, last but not least, the environmental accountability, and really starting to instigate at issues of climate change and climate commitments, but distilling this to a level of understanding so that we can make more informed business decisions. And we'll elaborate on that. So it's not only about climate change as something that's outside in, it's about how do you understand this, how do you understand what your impact is in the manner in which you run your operation and what that accountability factor should look like. So we should optimally see ourselves in the sphere of biodiversity when we get to the complexities thereof so that we can make slightly different decisions. However, looking at where we are today, I am almost intrigued about where we are on the basis of where we're domiciled or where we exist from an international landscape. And this influences how we grow up, the decisions that we are taking qualitatively and quantitatively, the interaction with modernity and other things, and therefore informing in some way or the other the consciousness of the buyer. So if you move to the north, you will see a customer base that's asking slightly different questions. Is this biodegradable packaging? Is this sustainable as a product? Before I can worry about the quality of the skincare, I actually want to know the consciousness of the enterprise that I'm supporting. So up north, you start to see a whole lot of, I vote with my purse. Also because maybe the pressure on the disposable income is slightly different to that of our dynamic. But also, interestingly enough, you also see that when we come to our localized regions or to our continent, the lower, or slower support towards local brands and how we affiliate our identity with our purchases and how that dynamic and behavior starts to inform where we sit in this whole sphere of consumerism. But if you move over to the left of where we are right now in terms of the states, there's a feeling to buying. And maybe all of these other aspects sitting either on the north, on the west, or the east of our sitting is really shaping our context and maybe challenging our context and maybe scrutinizing what is the extent of the buyer loyalty with regards to their core value systems. And this is something that we continue to engage with. But as Africans, we have been highlighted to be quite brand loyal over and above everything. So these are some statistical information that really instigated issues of climate change and decision-making for buying at a European level, and second-hand clothing as really sitting at 42% of EU. The more south you come, the more that notion seems to disappear in terms of how we attribute our spending. So the point I'm trying to make is that the South African consumer has its own identity. The African consumer has its own DNA, and therefore, do we understand that well enough to be able to speak to that on a sustainable long-term basis is the beckoning question. But as Daniel has covered, we have competing priorities in the country. So we can flick a coin anyhow. We can be confronted with inequality in education. We can be confronted with political uncertainty. We can be confronted with issues of poverty. We can be confronted with being grey-listed. We can be confronted with social unrest, and the list goes on, as we are familiar with it. So therefore, but that's not where the intelligence sits. It's about systematically at a macro level are we able to solve so that we may be able to self-sustain and continue to exist? And as you would guess, this is a question bigger than the retail sector, but I think that the retail is in the center of this, because it's the one thing that really binds the have and have-nots in terms of patterns and spending and foot traffic and digital savviness. So therefore, when we are confronted with these competing priorities, is it a retail flux, is it a macroeconomic stance? And I think that we can quickly come to the conclusion, does it matter where it sits? It sits within a sphere. So, but having said that, that the outcomes of all of these aspects, compounded by the fact that the disposable income is under pressure, we start to sit up a little bit and say, if this continues to be under pressure at the scale and the rate that it is at, what does this mean for local prosperity and longevity in terms of both from a safety perspective, both from a deterrent of unrest perspective, both from an innovation perspective out of a really healthy educational system that can be able to take advantage of our higher birth rates in terms of the continent. And therefore, are we optimally positioning the continent to be able to take advantage of what at a future is a deficit in terms of macroeconomic succession planning? If we remain where we are in terms of our Gini coefficient and all of these competing challenges that I've just mentioned, we will be snoozing on the job, and that it will not be our future to really take advantage of. So why am I framing this in this particular conversation? And really, why are we looking at these things and talking about these trends, and what can we deduce from it that can be something that's quite positive out of really a bad situation? I think that I don't intend to overplay what has been said about our resilience as a South African nation, but maybe there is a healthy medium that we can reach in this dialogue. So in terms of the debt statistics that we see, we have the presence, the physical presence inside of our retail outlets of both the haves and the have-nots. And we have different dynamics at play as to how they make decisions for buying. And we have influences in terms of psychology as how they have been coerced into those decisions. So therefore, inside of the paradigm that we're looking at, is there an ethical dilemma? Or are we actually much better leveraged to be able to move the needle? But if you look at the South African household debt to income, I actually, Daniel, thought that statistics on dependency on social grant was lower than 40%. So that for me was quite astonishing. With a tax base of about 16 million, you can do the math. And with maybe 20% of that 16 million trying to activate some kind of immigration as a safety net. So, but if we look at the disposable income and we look at the spending pattern and we look at how much or how many days that actually lasts, and are we actually sitting at a comfortable place where we have a collaboration that starts to shape the thinking of the individual households towards a more financial sustainability outcome? This is where I'm going to spend a few minutes. So, David Brooks narrates this book, The Second Mountain. Has any of us read this? Fascinating to me. And I have the privilege now of sharing it metaphorically to be able to engage the conversation of business consciousness and the benefits that we're sitting on from a compliance perspective that we can turn around and be able to leverage what the difficult situation that we're in. So, David Brooks, highly successful, has the privilege of having climbed his corporate ladder and worked with incredible people in his profession, starts to paint this metaphor using the mountains, Mountain 1 and Mountain 2. And it says, typically in Mountain 1, you have eager professionals that are climbing the ladder. They're ambitious. They want to make their mark in the world. They are moving from sphere to sphere, and they challenge themselves consistently to be able to arrive at a place of acquiring their goals and ticking off their bucket list, whatever that may look like. And it says, go on to say, is making an observation that for a long time or for a short time, you might be in that sphere whereby you are making that productivity or that productive move towards the top. And it says he has directly been impacted by this in his own life, where you work at something and you achieve it, you stand on the podium, you receive your acknowledgement, you go to bed, and when you wake up the next day, it just doesn't have quite the same feeling as it did the night before. And so how do we make that more elastic? And this is where he goes on his own fact-finding mission and says, actually, through his downtime and how he tried to re-emerge from that situation, he comes up with the notion of the second mountain. And the second mountain notion is saying that this is a conscious rebellion from the status quo and saying that it's moving from a psychology of independence into the comfort of interdependence. And the second mountain is where people are starting to be more concerned about the quality of wine in the wine glass rather than the quantity of glasses that have gone through. And therefore, second mountain people are trying to take more out of life. But I think that Diane Ackerman captures it well. Says, I don't want to get to the end of my life to only realize that I've lived the length of it, but I actually want to live the depth of it. So this is the critical crossroads that we find ourselves in as individuals in communities, in households that pour into corporates, into businesses that sit in supply chain globally, that make important decisions, that shift the narrative for our country. So the sweet spot is not actually about arriving and climbing mountain one and coming to a valley of some sort, and then climbing mountain to find the success. How can we bridge these two so that from as early as in our venture, in our vocation, we can have the benefits of mountain 1 and 2? Quite notably, he goes on to say, and this is where I'm going. He goes on to say, there are mountain 1 and mountain 2 organizations. And this is the crossroads that really starts to say, are we rushing to get to the end of the length of the journey, or are we exploring the width? So what are the opportunities that I think and that I've noted, I've interacted with to be quite optimal for the sector that we're talking about today? Number one, global supply chains. Global supply chains are under scrutiny. Global supply chains are collapsing the local regulations and coming to elevate the global demand in terms of compliance, in terms of green taxes, in terms of legislation. So it's an interesting phenomenon. And therefore, even if we did not want to participate on the interconnectedness of economic proficiency, social equity, and environmental accountability, if we sit in global supply chains, we simply have no choice. Or we have to find another customer or another place to import, to export to. Because whether it is a levy of green tax at the border or it is being offloaded silently from the global supply chain because it just takes too much trouble to get you on par, we are sitting at that crossroads. But thankfully, we have the power of decision making. We have the power of data, we have the power of analytical mindsets, and therefore we do have the advantage of exploring the width of this life in terms of those global supply chain. But it's not a selfish ambition for it to reach this level of really legitimacy. It's a lift as you rise. It's not about Mazars having their act together. It's about Mazars having their act together and how do we lift the competitive landscape. So the core difference when it comes to the lens of ESG or sustainability is less to do with how do you measure to your competition. No, how do you measure to your best version as an organization? And that is where the magic is got to happen. I said two things. What is the other thing at our advantage when we sit in aspects of retail? I think that the manner in which we continue to recognize performance on the short and the long term will be the outcome of where we sit in this uncertainty in the next while. So what is the incentive driving the buyer from supporting local or from having a nice cushy and posh trip to the UK as a buyer or to China and sources things cheaper, quicker, and effortlessly? Or what is the incentive of the buyer to stick it out with the supplier that's sitting in the middle of Gqeberha, employing 100 people and really struggling with the math, but the quality is up to date? So therefore, the lift as you rise phenomenon and looking into the supply chain is beyond compliance. It's a phenomenon that says, how are we sitting on the positioning of the first and second mountain, and what are we instigating at as business? We can be quick to say at a macroeconomic level, is this my problem to solve? A year and a half ago, when we were sitting in a burning country, whether it was our problem to solve or not, we were sitting in the problem. What are the takeaways from that? That we can build a consciousness towards and a layer of resilience through future fitting our businesses. That is the beginning question. If we look at the opportunities that are at hand in how we run our enterprises through people, influencing indirectly the domestic environment pouring into the schooling environment pouring into the university where our talent pool comes into. So therefore, the frustration that we may feel with the youngest generation is the outcome of our parenting. They have arrived. So therefore, the shift from independence to interdependence is quite critical, because not so long from now, we will be able to answer questions that we may ask indirectly when we're sitting comfortably on decisions that relate to CSI. And the notion here is that business must be able to find a compelling reason to engage. What's in it for me? If we cannot articulate that response to that question, we will not be able to have the commitment that is required to stay in it as long as possible, because there's nothing really quantifiable that's in it for us. Why do people get upset about rising taxi fares and go and burn the library? It's because somebody sat somewhere with a box to tick and decided that that community needed a library. Maybe they needed a clinic. Maybe they were in short supply of a spaza shop with fresh food. So I'm trying to say the flattening of the corporate ego and the engagement and expectation from the social dynamic is an imperative in how we move forward. Radically, I can say, we must not give something into a community where we are not clear what they're bringing to the table. What can they bring to the table? We're looking at unemployment stats. Somebody sitting there is a carpenter. Somebody can paint that's sitting there. There's an auntie that can cook there. There's a thug there that can be redeployed into security. That's what we're sitting on. And therefore, when we give that opportunity for them to sort themselves out and quantify what they can bring onto the table, we level it up. We have a better chance at relation and respect in the conversation, and we have something that looks like what they are. If I see myself in the library, I will not go in the library. But if the library is a structure that reminds me somebody's sitting somewhere in an office ticking a box and deploying something that doesn't align to my needs, probabilities are high that will continue at the pace of destruction. So I'm saying there are opportunities in unemployment, not 60% maybe, but even if we can convert to the 20%, we have a higher degree of success. Now, the opportunities that lie there require of us to be a little bit more organized as business, a little bit more organized as sectors, a little bit more collaborative. So therefore, the elements of sustainability really start to instigate it. How are we able to collaborate with natural competitors on a socioeconomic challenge, competing challenge, that we can commit to not on 1 or 2 years, over a sustainable period of time, and turn it on its head. And I, being an optimist, I think we can do this as business, because we have the power to apply our minds and to really start to flip these statistics. Because can you imagine that if this continues on the trend and unemployment rises, dependency on social grants rises, pressure on disposable income rises, and there is no viable alternative in terms of an echoing voice in the conversation, then the odds are against us. So resilience for me and future fit for me in terms of the African landscape, in terms of business confidence, has got the ability to collaborate towards the same goals and to really start to make magic. We love these things here. These things here look colorful. In many of our integrated reporting, in many of our marketing material, they're there, but they just sit outside of strategy 9 out of 10 times. That's where the rubber meets the road. We cannot commit to something that doesn't have a responsible official at the right level, fully understanding this and breaking it down for our own enterprise into our business model and aligning it to the core of our sustainability. So if I were to rock up at your enterprise and ask you a sustainability question and you refer me to the sustainability person, you have no integration, you have no depth on it, and tomorrow somebody might convince you of another competing priority and you change your mind. So systematically, we give up on ourselves on the way when we don't strategically engage with the topics. So retail with wide supply chains, some quite massive listed enterprises, some really small, has got the power to leverage that for the betterment of where we need to get to. Many a times, even through compliance, that we sit with unspent spending on enterprise development, on skills development, because we just didn't apply ourselves long enough into it to be able to make magic. So therefore, the compound of those, sitting at a sectorial level, in collaboration, consistently pouring into one ill that we can be able to shift and measure, report, and quantify, is where our resilience lies. So let me conclude by saying that I believe greatly that the power within private enterprises has an element of agility. The challenges that confront us can be cumulative and seem overwhelming, but they are not insurmountable. But alone, we can make little progress. We have got to go slow to go fast. We have got to collaborate. We have got to neutralize a little bit of our self-interest, and we've got to be able to put our minds together and put our country on the map. But this guy says it better. It says, we cannot control the direction of the wind, but we can adjust our sails. I think that many of the people within corporate South Africa have got the privilege of education. Education is not a qualification, a certificate that hangs on the wall. It is the depth of how we can be able to analytically solve problems because we have been trained to think. So some of the high-level challenges and confronting questions that will continue to look at us in terms of this sector will be really focused on the gives and takes of short-term or integrated thinking, the ability to solve or collaborate or to stand as islands and slowly diminish. But my challenge to us is that we can make an indelible mark into where we are now and how we actually shift our sails in the direction that we want. Otherwise, we may as well activate our immigration status. Thank you very much.